The two-day EU summit opens today in Brussels, with leaders set to rule out moving to full Brexit trade talks after negotiations stalled. EU President Donald Tusk dashed the UK Prime Minister Theresa May's hopes for Brexit talks to progress beyond the matters of the divorce. Meanwhile, many EU leaders want to seize the opportunity created by the isolationist leanings of the Trump administration. The summit will also reaffirm their full commitment to the Iran nuclear deal regardless of an American pullout. For more about the analysis on the EU summit, what's likely to be achieved in Beijing, we have Mr. Wang Yiwei, who is the director of the Center for EU Studies at Renmin University here in China. Welcome, sir. In Brussels, we would like to welcome Fraser Cameron, Senior Advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. Long time no see, sir. It's great to have you back once again on our program. And in Southampton, we have Mike Bastin. Professor Bastin is a professor at the University of Southampton. And welcome as well. Let's get started. Mr. Cameron. The EU summit is struggling with so many priorities that I don't even know as a journalist as to where to start to ask you a question. Can you help me with that? Where to start?
Well, it's true there's a big agenda, but traditionally the October European Council deals with economic issues, and I think, there's a pretty good economic story to tell. Growth has picked up. There's a new digital agenda pushed forward by the Estonian presidency. Plus, they will be reviewing the improving situation regarding migration. Then they'll be looking at a couple of foreign policy issues, reaffirming the importance of the Iran deal, taking a stance on Brexit, and I think we all know what the outcome will be, basically that there's not sufficient progress to start talks on trade just now.
Right.
And perhaps they'll find time to look at Russia and Turkey. So it's a big agenda.
It is a big agenda, and eventually will there be any consensus reached at this point compared to what we have already know, Professor Bastin? Can you help us understand better?
Well, I think I agree with the points that just made. What I would say on Brexit, obviously the conclusion will be there's insufficient progress being made, and there will be no progression to trade talks. But what I think the EU will announce is an internal discussion, and they will increase internal discussion amongst their 27 members as to the sort of Brexit that they would like to see. So I think that will be a positive move. So there will be some momentum gained, but it will be internal to the EU, and I expect that to be announced very, very shortly.
Okay. Professor Wang, as an observer, of course you've been watching the European countries for a long time. So there are a lot of different issues. Internally, they've got, even separations within country, for example, Spain, the Catalan crisis. And then there's the Brexit. The UK might want to, on certain terms, withdraw, but they don't know. At this point, no consensus. And then there is the issue of, what to do with the other parts of the world. Trade, for example, the EU has. And also migration. And then there are things within the EU, for example, it's likely to be the relations between France and Germany, which is evolving all the time. Meanwhile, you also have another issue of the EU's relationship with longtime partner and ally, the United States, reflected by the Iran crisis, and also EU's role internationally. For example, what's their stance on DPRK? All of these are facing the EU leaders at this point. Professor Wang, do you think there will be anything concrete at this point for this EU summit?
Well, I think the top agenda, of course, is about Brexit, because it's about the future of Europe.
But at this point there is no consensus. What the UK is talking about is totally not within.
But there's a consensus.
Okay.
That the path of negotiation is unsatisfied from both UK side and the European side. So we should make the progress. That's the consensus. But how to make that progress? There's the asymmetric negotiation. The UK side is eager to have some trade issue. They want to negotiate with other partners like United States, China, the FTA.
Right.
But the European side is, look. First, the two concerns about the mobility with the migrants, the citizens, and also about the institution. So it's an asymmetric focus.
UK's focus, the EU is not interested. EU's focus, the UK would not be providing some satisfying answers, not even talking points. Mr. Cameron, where to go from here?
Well, I think the remarkable thing is how united the EU 27 have been. For the last several months, they've kept to the script, given the chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, full confidence that he has to speak for the 27, and that's what he has done. So basically, most of the 27 are not that bothered about Brexit. They're bothered more about how to keep the EU moving on to deal with the rest of the world, as you mentioned, and also to resolve some of their own internal problems. But the actual show is still on the road. Things are looking up on the economic front, and politically, it's not such a bad place to live and to be.
Okay, not at all. It is a fascinating place, shall I say, Mr. Cameron. And I know you're saying that not because you're working for the European policy centers, but from the bottom of your heart. And let me ask you further about that. You talk about, how the EU is dealing with the rest of the world. One of the things, if we talk about concrete issues, that is the trade, right? I mean, at this point, French want to have some different kinds of deals, free trade deals. EU has it with, the Latin America, Australia, New Zealand, but France probably want to have some different kind. So how is that going to be reconciled? This is something very concrete. This is money. So, and that is the very bottom line of the EU. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. We've had divisions on trade for many years, but we always come to an agreement. For example, in the next few weeks, we'll be signing the biggest free trade deal in the world, the EU-Japan deal, ever since China joined the WTO. This is the biggest single trade deal. And the EU has many other trade deals in the pipeline, from Mercosur to dealing with Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia. We've already signed deals with Vietnam, Singapore. These are far-reaching deals. The EU is the biggest trade actor in the world and the strongest proponent of free trade. What France is simply asking now is that when there are some sensitive sectors at stake, the Commission should have a screening process to look at them. It's a pretty sensible suggestion, I think.
Professor Bastin, do you agree with what Mr. Cameron just said? During this painful transformation of the EU, actually, there are a lot of concrete things that are being done or being really concretely discussed. Professor Bastin, do you agree?
Yeah. Yes, I do, and I think I would add that the British government have shown, I think, quite tremendous misunderstanding of how the EU would react once the Brexit referendum took place and the negotiations started. I don't think they anticipated such coming together of the EU nations, really speaking as one, and all of them basically behind Barnier, and really just making the point very, very clear to the UK that they've got to pay more, they can't be seen to benefit. So yes, the EU is still solid, very, very solid. Now, individual nations, as Fraser said, will always be looking at slightly different deals, but in the end they all come together because they know in the long term they're all better off. So the UK really got an uphill task here against a solid 27-member group.
But there is one question. I earlier asked also the Le Pen, who is the former French Prime Minister. There is a rise of the far right in European politics, and many of those parties are against the free trade, against the migration. So circumstances that worked before might not be what the reality is political these days for the European countries. Mr. Cameron, can we be still optimistic, like you say, about free trade? After Japan, will the EU be able to, with the member support, go further?
Yes, it will, because the benefits of globalization are so obvious as a result
well,
of
that you, according to you,
well,
but not necessarily according to some of the rising far-right parties in some countries. You see that in Germany, you see that in Austria. You also see that in different kinds of very promising economies earlier. So what is likely to be the picture?
Well, you were commenting just last year that people were expecting Marine Le Pen to win in France, Mr. Wilders to win in the Netherlands. It didn't happen. So the far-right parties are still very much a minority. They're only in one government at the moment, in Austria quite recently. The general trend is against the rise of populism now, and it may ebb and flow a little bit, but the majority of the political parties in Europe are still in the center ground. They're still supporting free trade, they're still supporting a market economy, and that's the good news.
Professor Wang, is that also your observation?
We hope so, but so far we are not so much expected that there's any FTA negotiation between China and the European Union. The European Union agreed that after the bilateral investment treaty, maybe it's possible to talk about the FTA, but I think now we can start to do the research, the possibility of that kind of bilateral free trade agreement, given that the global trade is I think it's now better than before. So European Union focus on the free trade, should work together with China to put forward the globalization. But the European Union still have many concerns about China's so-called global capacity, market economy, and then public procurement. So I think this is technician issues cannot be prohibited.
Professor Wang, you raised an interesting direction of discussion, which is in the apparent absence of the United States, which is talking about America first and withdraw from the international system to some extent. Will the Europeans, represented by the EU, work with other parties to seek out a new solution? Mr. Cameron, how big is that hope?
Well, it's a reality. I mean, the EU and China, for example, are now the foremost defenders of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. They're both basically committed to supporting the multilateral system, including on regional security. The EU and China are speaking with one voice on Iran, for example. Take a similar view on DPRK, another example. I think, coming back briefly to the FDA question, you've got to distinguish between the kind of FTAs, the quality of FTAs, because many FTAs are just about trade, and of course that's not the most important aspect. Today's real FTAs are about services, they're about regulatory cooperation and behavior, and that is the difficulty we have with China. We do want eventually an FTA with China, but first we have to make a broad agreement on investment conditions before we can move on to the next stage. So you have to distinguish between the kind of FTA you really want in today's world. There's big differences.
Professor Wang, briefly respond.
But the service trade, I think we can start from this area, and then push for the new, like the e-commerce, and even digital economy. I think we can focus on that.
All right, a lot of different directions in our conversation, but I still want to focus on the EU summit itself. One of the things that is likely to illustrate what kind of role the Europeans would play in the future with a different America is the Iran nuclear deal. Of course, Mr. Cameron, you mentioned that earlier. Now, it's expected that the EU summit this time going to hold on to what has been agreed 2015. But if the United States did not follow it, what can the EU do? After all, it's one of your biggest achievements as the EU politically on the international stage, the Iran deal. Mr. Cameron.
Well, the EU has made quite clear they will continue to support the deal, as has Russia and as has China. Trump has not actually scuppered the deal. He's basically kicked the ball to Congress. And the EU and China have been lobbying the Congress for the last 2-3 weeks, I think quite successfully, to show them that, you know, it's much better to have Iran in this deal, containing its nuclear program, rather than being outside it. So I'm fairly confident that the deal will hold. But we, the international community, including the EU and China, have to continue to lobby for this.
Right. Mr. Cameron, you used the word successful over the past few days in lobbying the U.S. Congress. What kind of success are you specifically referring to? Can you reveal to us?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Croker, the chair of the House Representative International Relations Committee, they both come out saying the deal is good. The fact that we've got also senior members of these cabinet, including Mattis, including Tillerson, General Kelly, General McMaster, they've all said we should not scupper the deal. So I think Trump is actually pretty isolated here. He's basically appealing to his base for political reasons. He's also under pressure from the Saudis and Israel, but I think essentially we can still ensure that the deal sticks.
Will this be an interesting case study, Professor Bastin, about exactly what is going to be the role of the EU on some of the most important international issues. And this, of course, the Iran deal is totally related to what's going to happen with the DPRK nuclear issue, because it's going to be a preview as to what's going to happen and what's not going to happen.
I think you're right. I think it's a very good example of a change in the balance of power in the world economy. I mean, the EU is by far China's largest trading partner, not America. And gradually, I think we will see that the power of the US decline. Trump has really, again, shown tremendous misjudgment. He is, as Fraser says, totally isolated on this. And I think it will highlight the fact that really the EU, in support with China and Russia, are really moving most of the agendas facing the global economy forward, and it may well be that the Americans actually don't scupper the deal, that there could be a change, quite likely that will be the case. So the EU are really moving into the forefront, replacing the Americans, really.
Professor Wang, are you as optimistic as the other two colleagues? Is this a show of relevancy of the EU and China and other countries reflected by the Iran deal? Or is it a demonstration of irrelevancy of these countries when the United States withdraw from certain kinds of agreement?
Even go beyond that, I always argue that when I work in Brussels, the China and the European Union actually share more common values in the international stage, multilateralism, multipolar world, and then also diplomatic negotiation. So the U.S. is more bilateral, even unilaterally, and so I think the China and European Union should work more closely to push forward globalization, global governance.
All right. And before we go, there's one crucial question I also want to ask all of you very briefly. At this time, we don't see much as to who will rise as one of those leaders of the EU. Previously, we talked about Germany and France. Now we see both have some difficulties dealing with their internal issues. Mr. Cameron, is there going to be new leadership within the EU, leading the EU countries further, besides just the European Commission?
It's always been the same, and it will continue to be the same. It will be France and Germany. So Merkel and Macron will continue to lead the EU.
All right. Well, Professor Bastin, do you agree with that? Very briefly from you.
I agree, but if that was in order, I think I would say Germany and France. I think Germany is still by far the strongest economy, not just in Europe, but very, very robust and resilient. German brands have a global reputation, particularly in engineering, and I think that will remain the case.
Professor Wang?
Well, it used to be the Mercosi. Now maybe it's 2M, Macron and Merkel work together. This, I think China would hope of the European Union play a more important role in the world.
Well, certainly the EU summit has a lot of things to struggle with, and possibly some hope as well arise from there. We want to thank the three of you for being with us. Fraser Cameron, Mike Bastin, Wang Yiwei. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you so much.